Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we are from group 4. We are going to discuss about verbal communication. Before that, I would like to introduce myself and my member. The first one is Afifah Lutfiah. The second is Dea Khoirunnisa. And the third, it's me, Novi Oktaviani. And the last one is Tahriidl. Now I'm going to discuss about the polyfunctionality of dramatic language. The first is appellative function. Conversely, it is true that of all these functions, it is the appellative function in particular that is dependent on dialogue, and the importance of this function increases in proportion to the degree the dialogue partner is involved. The more the speaker tries to influence or change the mind of the dialogue partner, and the more he or she reacts to the latter's reservation and objections, the stronger the appellative function will be. One special form of exerting influence or persuasion is the imperative or command, which of course assumes the extent of a certain relationship of authority and dependency in the dialogue partners. In the type of dramatic speech in which the appellative function predominates, the general nature of dramatic speech as verbal action becomes especially evident. Acts of persuasion and imperative represent speech acts which, independently of whether the attempt to persuade is successful or not, or whether the imperative is carried out or not, actually alter the dramatic situation. It is therefore not surprising that a predominant appellative function is particularly common in dramatic speech, and that dialogues in which one partner attempts to persuade or win over the other have been virtually. Okay, this is the example about appellative function. We can see that the predominance of the appellative function in Emilia's speeches is shown by the double repetition of her appeals to her father to give her the teacher, and the intensity of her appeals is increased by the use of a rhetorical figure. The consistent repetition of direct forms of address, my doctor, my father, and etc., and the brevity of the individual speeches also serve to intensify the references to the dialogue partner, and thus the appellative function. Emilia repeatedly introduces new argument in her attempt to change her father's mind, and there is, in fact, not a single speech and not even a single section of her speeches that is not subordinate to the overall appellative function, either in the form of a demand or argument in support of that. Okay, the second material is pathic function. Unlike its appellative counterpart, the pathic function, which is associated with the channel between speaker and listener and is designed to create and maintain the contact between them, is of greater relevance to the external communication system. By channel and contact, we don't just mean the poorly psychical link which enable the dramatics to convey information from sender to receiver. We are also referring to the psychological willingness of both parties to communicate with each other. Thus, the empathic function is served in the external system by such diverse factors as the spatial layout of stage and auditorium so as to guarantee the best possible acoustic and visibility, the title and the use of advertising to arouse interest, and finally the receiver's involvement in the play as a result of either the structures of suspense, the use of epic communication structures, and the possibilities for identification with one or more of the figure in the text tactic itself. This is the example about the empathic function. We can see that the extreme reduction of the expressive function, the almost complete absence of references in the individual utterance to an individual expressive subject, is shown here in the similarity and interchangeability of the speeches. The referential function is restricted to a discussion of the intention of saying something, though this intention is itself no more than a purported one from which everyone strives to escape, and the appellative function, which usually features strongly when insults are exchanged, has been eliminated since the two figures have no real intention of insulting each other. The insults, like the attestations of politeness, are all part of a word game construed to pass the time. Speaking has become an end in itself, a purely empathic form of communication whose sole remaining purpose is constantly to reassure the figure that a channel of communication does actually still exist, that they are not even aware that this is itself a volume only emphasizes the fact that this dialogue has been reduced to one single function. Okay, next material is metalingual function. The metalingual function is associated with the code and like the empathic function, is generally only present in latent form. However, situations do arise in both ordinary speech and dramatic dialogue, in which it can step into the foreground. This always occurs whenever the verbal code used is explicitly or implicitly developed as a central term. This is the example about metalingual function. For the example, we can see that Locke, inhibited by the awareness of the discrepancy between his own and asked linguistic register between his own restricted and his partner's elaborate code, is obviously searching for a word referring to the lower abdominal region of a woman, which would not be an insult to a more delicate text. And he hit upon the unusual circumlocution of underneath. The next material is poetic function. The poetic function is manifested in the way a message refers to itself and thus draws the audience attention to its structure and constituent part in ordinary speech. This dimension is dispelled by the fact that the message is made to refer automatically to the object. Normally, the poetic function only applies to the external communication system and not to the communication process taking place between the various features. Okay, for the example, Shakespeare's Richard II, especially after Act 3, Skins 2 contains a number of speeches by the central protagonists that are characterized by their great poetic intensity. This has led a number of notable critics such as Mark van Doren 14 to regard King Richard himself as a poet who, in his tendency to include in poetic speech. That's all for me. The next material will be presented the second presenter. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Dea Khoirunnisa. I will present the next material, which is about verbal communication and action. As previously, now that verbal communication is type of interaction between individuals that use words and involve speaking and listening. In oral communication, the sender and receiver exchange thought or ideas verbal. The And the next is the identity of speech and action. The definition of action as the transition from one situation to other in the sense development, a transition which, depending on the kind of situation involved, is selected deliberately from a number of different possibilities rather than simply causally determined. That is clear that this kind of delivery change in the dramatic situation. And the of identity of speech and action. The first one is speech related to action. From this is already clear that the distance between speech and action is likely to be variable, and complete lack of this stage, that is when they are identically, is a special case that in dramatic text. The other from kinds of the text. Although dramatic speech is always performative speech, the speech is a form of action. As defined by speech theory, the identity of speech and of action designed to change a situation does not apply to every dramatic stage. And the second is speech unrelated to action. When speech is contrasted with action, it is not identical to, but not least, still refers to it directly. It is then possible to say that speech and action are unrelated to and that they run parallel to each other. And next, verbal communication and dramatic figures. Uh, they have four types. dramatic figure, and the first one is restriction is the convergence between language and dramatic figure. And the second is the superimposition of a poetic function on an expressive function. And the third, the superimposition of epic communication structure on figure reference. And last, the superimposition of reference to the situation on figure reference. And the characterization style language is to have mm, many to have. The person is explicit self-presentation. When a figure consequently outlines its feature or itself, and this might even in the context of either monologue and dialogues. And, and the light in implicate self-presentation is stylistic texture as a part of the implicate characterization process. On the other hand, is a picture of the light literally text. And maybe that's enough material that I complete more or less apologies. And the next material will be delivered by my friends.
Okay, the next material about the monological speech. There are two types, monological versus dialogue. What is monological? Monological is a way communication with of either just one speaker or have one unified semantic direction. And then what is dialogue? Dialogue is two-way communication between two or more figures who represent opposite and have a unity of meaning and change semantic direction between each of the uterine. Next, what is monological tendencies in dialogue? There are two causes. The first one is disrupted communication. For example, if they are sickly or psychologically unwilling or unable to communicate. And the second one, there are two chains of semantic direction because the tension that exists in the interrelation between the various figures is sustained. Here the example of monological tendencies in dialogue from Magdalen's one-act play Interior. Here there are two different speakers and this passage only represents a single context. And when we redistribute the speeches or alter the boundaries between them, so the meaning of the dialogue will not be affected in any reaching way, and the dialogue will collapse into a series. Next, about the dialogical tendencies in soliloquy. So, what is soliloquy? Soliloquy is communication which refers to the speaker's solitude. This means that there is no actual address on stage and that the figure is thus left to talk to himself. And the dialogue tendency on soliloquy because the identity of the speaker and listener will define the soliloquy as dissolved into a contrast between speaker and addresses. Producing a contrast between different semantic contexts. Other cause is dialogical tendencies when the speaker is split into two or more conflict subjects. This form which might be described of two subjects using pronoun. Here the example, this internal conflict is clearly marked by the emphatic repetition is not, the self-apostrophizing, and the switch from one personal pronoun to another. Next, about the soliloquy, convention versus motivation in soliloquy. The soliloquy is based primarily on a convention, an unspoken agreement between author and receiver, which, unlike conditions prevailing in the real world, allow a dramatic figure to think aloud and talk to itself. Thus, soliloquy is frequently used as a vehicle for transmitting information on previous or future events in concentrate from. For example, in Roman comedy, were often used to provide the audience with a continued commentary on the plot and thereby help it to follow the various intrigues. Because of the frequent use of deception, dodges and misunderstanding were often somewhat confusing. For the soliloquy as a convention, as it occurs in the classical drama, and the realistic or motivated soliloquy as permitted by naturalism, are not two different historical forms of one and the same structure, but two categorically different semiotic structures. Next, about premediate form versus spontaneous improvisation. The contrast between convention and motivated soliloquy tend to coincide with the stylistic and textural contrast between soliloquy with a clear disposition that often follow theoretical pattern, and those in which the associated and cumulative flow of verbal utterance is intended to stimulate the spontaneous of an ordinary speech. For example, of soliloquy with a clear and coherent disposition, we can examine Don Rodriguez's first soliloquy in Cornelia Lesser, an examination of all exciting drama soliloquy will reveal that most soliloquy should be classified as intermediate form on the spectrum between those two poles. Next, soliloquies of action and reflection. According to this criterion, we generally distinguish between soliloquy that are actional and those that are non-actional or reflection. In the former, the soliloquy constitutes an act that changes the situation. In this type of soliloquy, the speaker generally feels that he or she is faced with several different possibilities for action and then select one of them to follow. And this, even the revocation of decision, constitution and action, informative and commentative. Soliloquy should be understood an ideal abstraction, extreme type in which one function predominant in isolation. And in most soliloquy actional, informative and communicative elements combine with each other in varying proportion. Indeed, soliloquy may often be divided into sections in each of which a different element predominates. That the actional soliloquy in Lecit should correspond to one of the ideal types. Too closely is therefore by means the rule.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Afifah Lutfiah. Now I will continue the materials about the site and spectators. Okay. Okay, the aside and spectators, like the soliloquy, um, the aside can also be embedded with dialogue elements if it's addressed and spectators, and in the same way that the soliloquy of spectators can break through the internal communication system and establish an explicit mediating communication system by addressing the audience. The aside of spectators is also assigned a definite epic and mediatory function. The fact that this type of aside is generally but not exclusively found in comedy accord with the uh, the of-mentioned affinity between comedy and epic forms of information transmission. Yeah. This one example from Shakespeare, the Mechanic of Finance illustrates the and this example, Shakespeare introduced a technical term from the comedy of intrigue and thus the secondary code of the internal communication system. In the first aside, the audience is addressed only implicitly in the primary text, although this may easily be made more explicit by the use of mime and gesture. In the second aside, we can address the audience more explicitly by using a verbal gesture of pointing and an imperative. Okay, the next one, the dialogical aside. All the needs to be done is to group the figures participating in the dialogue aside together in front of the stage. Well, away from the other figures, in fact, this is the most common arrangement used in the performance of dialogical aside. Okay, for dialogical speech. In this dialogical speech, there is two perspective. There are perspective versus descriptive poetics of dialogue. Dialogue is regarded as the basic form in drama. The emphasis of conflict simulation elevate the action dialogue. That is one in which is speech contain an element action. And moreover, the result of our differential analysis of more relative quality of the contrast between soliloquy and dialogue and the monological and the dialogical. The first one, quantitative relations. The result of these will show that such quantitative relations are not pure surface phenomena, but that they are conditioned by the semantic deep structure of the text and in turn themselves condition the deep structure. A. Dialogue and polylogue. Polylogue. Dialogue, duologue, and polyglot. This is true of the quantitative division of dialogue into duologue, dialogue conducted by two figures, and polylogue, dialogue conducted by three or more figures. Dialogue, this is the difference between the duologue and polylogue. B. Frequency of interruption and speech length. In a quantitative analysis, it's also possible to determine the length of each individual speech or utterance and thus the frequency with which interruptions occur in a dialogue. That is the frequency of a semantic change of direction that result from a change of speaker. C. Verbal communication. As the dialogue progresses, however, the discussion become less hit with speech become longer and those also more coherent, articulate, coherent articulate expression of the various figure perspective. At the same time, although they do not actually lose sign of the given dramatic situation. Okay, the next one about temporal relation, succession, and simultaneity. Simultaneity. A. The relation of one utterance to another. Even when utterances are arranged successfully, there are often partial overlaps that lead to the partial simultaneity of the different utterances when one feature interrupts other. This one is an example. This pattern, the example show this pattern in which the speaker is interrupted by me, may, panel is repeated in unbroken serial streak more times and create a comic effect solely as a result of the mechanical repetition direct at the succession of different dialogue partners. Okay, the next one, temporal relation, succession, and simultaneity. The relationship between dialogues, there are dividing structures of simultaneous speech which are not just restricted a modern drama. We have already drawn attention to the way that two dialogues may be present simultaneously in the context of the aside. That's all from our group. Thank you for your nice attention. The next material will be delivered by group 5. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.